Celeste Bell, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview with the Brixton blog. You are, of course, here to speak about a film that you've just finished, a film which, in large part, is about your mum, Marianne or Marie Elliott, who will be better known to our readers and viewers as the punk icon Poly Styrene. The film is called Poly Styrene, I Am A Cliché, and I think that people can see it online towards the end of this month as part of the Glasgow Film Festival. Now, the film comes fairly hot on the heels of this fantastic book which you helped to produce, Dayglow, which indeed you launched, I'm sure, among other places, in Brixton, at the Brixton Library. Celeste, you must be very proud to have created these wonderful legacy pieces for your mum.
Yes, definitely, very proud. And it's been a real pleasure to do this, very rewarding experience.
Now, of course, your mum grew up here in Brixton. What sort of, I think initially on the Cowley estate, and then later on she moved to Evandale Road, just off Loughborough Road, which is right near where I'm speaking to you from now. An unusually snowy Brixton, in fact. What sort of a childhood do you think that your mum had growing up in Brixton? It would have been, I suppose, in the 1960s and 70s, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so growing up in Brixton was it was a very different Brixton to Brixton today, I think. Very, very different. You know, this was just sort of post-war. So she was born in the 50s in Bromley, and the family moved to Brixton when she was very small because my mum was mixed race and Bromley was very white, sort of very white and middle class at the time. And my grandmother, who was white English, she faced some prejudice there and sort of nothing overt, but you know, like dirty looks and kind of shocked faces. So she thought that Brixton would be a better environment for her kids because it was, you know, just starting in the late 50s to become more multicultural. And there was a sizable Afro-Caribbean community in the area. So I think that's what attracted my grandmother to Brixton. But it wasn't as multicultural, obviously, as it is now. It was still very, very, I would say it was, you know, still majority like white working class when my mother was growing up there. Yeah. So there was still actually a lot of racism in Brixton.
And your mum, of course, was half Somalian.
Yeah.
In the film, you actually talk about the fact that you feel that she experienced a particular type of racism because she was mixed race. That was the case in Brixton as well, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was everywhere. You know, Brixton there were more mixed race people, you know, and there were more Black people, but there was still the National Front. You know, there were a lot of skinheads. You know, skinheads weren't necessarily racist at that very early 60s stage. My mother had friends who were skinheads, but they were still very violent. And it was a very violent time.
So she had to be a tough cookie, and indeed you give the impression that she was a tough kid.
Yes, she was a tough kid. She was forced to be a tough kid because it was a tough environment. She went to a very rough school called Stockwell. It was called Stockwell Manor at that time. Later Stockwell Park. And now it's got a completely different name. I'm not sure what it's called now, but it's still there. And that was a big, huge, comprehensive school, and it was I think a lot of money was put into building it. So it was when she went there, it was all shiny, and she wanted to go for the facilities. They had a pool, but it was very rough. There were lots of fights, and she told me that there were, in fact, police would be patrolling the corridors because of knife crime. So, you know, people talk about knife crime now as like something relatively new, but it was actually a major issue then when my mum was growing up as well.
Yeah. And at what point did she move from Cowley Estate to Evandale Road? I remember from the book Dayglow that, you know, that was a better situation for the family.
Yes, so my grandmother, you know, came from quite a middle class sort of suburban background in Bromley and hated living on a council estate. She never felt happy. It was very cramped. The conditions were very, you know, they had the coal fires. You know, it was cold, it was damp, it was, you know, it was tough. And so when my grandmother got a house, a council house on the Evandale Road, it was a big sort of early Victorian terraced house. She was over the moon. I think the kids were less fussed because they actually had quite a nice time on the estate because they had a lot of friends, and they could play in the yard, and you know, it was a bit more fun, I think, for the kids. But for my grandmother, it was tough living there, and she was really happy that they got a house with a garden, and my grandmother was a huge gardener. She really loved that. But my mum must have been about 12 or 13 when they moved to the house, and she left home at 15, so she didn't actually get to spend too much time there.
So it was, you know, in some senses a tough childhood, but also quite a happy childhood a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So she leaves home around the age of 15. I'm guessing it wasn't too long after that that the chapter in her life that people know about begins. At some point, she sees the Sex Pistols playing on Hastings Pier and is inspired by that. And by 1976, I think it is, she has, of course, put together her band X-Ray Specs. They go on to record Germ-Free Adolescence with a number of well-known songs, perhaps the best known, Oh Bondage, Up Yours, absolutely, you know, influential song to this day. Now, when I watched the film Celeste, I mean, what really struck me from that period, watching the footage from that period, was first of all how brilliant your mum and her band were, but secondly how incredibly sort of condescending a lot of the journalists are who speak with her. I mean, I'm guessing that although the punk scene was her scene of choice, this was still quite a hostile scene for a woman, and possibly a woman of colour. I mean, do you get that sense too? I mean, it slightly makes my blood boil to see almost the bullying tactics that these journalists were using at the time when they spoke with your mum.
Yeah, I think it was a relatively hostile environment for anyone. You know, I think it was the late 70s. Everyone was, I think, trying to be cool, you know, the journalists, and it was all about, you know, being cool, being nonchalant, not giving a fuck. And my mum was actually a very sensitive person. So it was quite a tough environment. It wasn't just journalists, it was even the audiences. You know, these gigs, it was very boisterous, very rough, and you know, the spitting on stage, and you see in the film, and there's a scene where she's coming off stage, and people would like rush onto the stage, and they'd be grabbing her and trying to kiss her, and there was no, basically, I think you know, they weren't people weren't as respectful of boundaries, I think, at that time. There were no boundaries, essentially.
Right.
So it was, I think it was one of the toughest eras to be a musician. I think if you were a sensitive, you know, kind of vulnerable soul, as my mum was. But luckily she had that experience of growing up where she had to be tough, and she, you know, was a fighter. So that kind of got her through the initial, you know, got through it initially, but it wasn't enough for her to sustain a lifestyle like that for too long.
No, I mean, you can, I mean, I think she's very gracious in the way that she deals with these individuals, but you can also see, yes, that she's very sensitive, and also that she's highly intelligent. I mean, she's way ahead of these people and their condescending questions. And of course, her creativity, her artistry went way beyond X-ray specs and punk music. She was a fantastic visual artist, and I think that's one of the things that people need to know about and celebrate more. But she's a sensitive individual, highly intelligent, and around this time, people start to get a sense that she might have some mental health problems. I think she was misdiagnosed around that time. Is that right?
Yeah, so she was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia in the around the time that she was touring with X-ray specs, because she suffered a series of breakdowns, and she definitely showed, you know, some of the classic, let's say, symptoms of schizophrenia. So she was hearing voices, and she had hallucinations, and so she was misdiagnosed much later, must have been about 10 years later. She finally got the correct diagnosis of bipolar disorder. But her type of bipolar disorder was a very severe form of bipolar, where, you know, there was a kind of crossover with schizophrenia. So in some ways it was understandable why she was misdiagnosed. There wasn't maybe as much knowledge at the time of, you know, there wasn't, mental health, you know, wasn't what it is now. Obviously there's still a lot of improvement that needs to be made, but I think there was, you know, it was still quite an trial and error type period. And so, for example, the treatments as well, like she had electric shock therapy.
Wow.
You know, for example. So it was, you know, it was very different. And then the other factor, of course, is that people of colour, you know, Black British mainly, have been, you know, disproportionately misdiagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia in this country, historically and to this day as well. So that's you know, another factor to bear in mind.
Yeah. So she found herself, I would imagine, in quite a confused and difficult situation in a whole number of ways at the end of the 70s. Then, of course, I think in 1981, she meets your dad, and you come along quite soon after that. And your mum, as well as meeting your dad and having you, she also begins a spiritual journey into the Hare Krishna faith. I'm wondering, are your earliest memories, Celeste, from the Hare Krishna temple in Hertfordshire, the one bought for the movement by George Harrison, which I believe you and your mum moved to?
Yes, so my earliest memories are, I mean, I was born when my mum, just before my mum joined the movement, but she joined when I was about 6 months old. So yeah, my earliest memories are of not the manor, because my mum moved to the manor when I was about 3, 4. Before that, we were living near the Soho Street Temple in London. So we lived in Baker Street,
right,
and we would go to the temple every day. So that was the earliest kind of Hare Krishna memory, was being in the London temple. And I was actually going to a sort of normal, regular, like primary school there in the West End. But then we moved to the Manor when I was about 4, and I went to school in the Manor. So
I'm guessing
it was more of a full immersion.
Yeah, I'm guessing that was tough then. If you were aware of another life before that in central London, a more ordinary type of education. I mean, what was life like in the Temple in Hertfordshire?
I mean, to be honest, it was much more tough leaving the Manor and going back to school in London than the other way, because life in the Manor was very idyllic. Especially maybe, it wouldn't have been for everyone if you're an adult, but if you were a child, I don't think you can have a happier childhood really than being in that environment, because we were living in a country estate. It was surrounded by land, woodland, park, gardens and woods, and we had total freedom to play and explore and be outside all the time. It was a community, so you felt very safe, where and you had freedom, so it was safety and freedom. I think for children, you don't get much better than that. Certainly being a child in a city London is much more difficult than in that kind of utopian environment.
And yet it was your decision, I think, to move back to Brixton in with your grandmother and your mum, who at this time was called Maharani. She'd been given the name Maharani by the Hare Krishna movement. Your decision to move out. Now, was that because you felt that you weren't persuaded by the spiritual teachings? Had had the distance grown between you and the religion, or was it that you and your mum weren't getting on so well? Why that decision to move away from the Temple and back to Brixton?
I mean, I was only 8 years old, so it was my decision, but it wasn't at the same time. Okay. But the main issue was my mother's mental health.
Right.
And she'd actually taken me out of the Hare Krishna sort of ashram where I was previously, and I was just living. We weren't in the temple at that point. We were just living near the temple in a house, and her mental health was very bad. So that's why I had to leave. And that's why I decided to leave at the same time. But it wasn't really my choice. I was going to be removed from her care no matter what. But I just made the initial kind of, I kind of made the decision, but it had to happen because she wasn't able to look after me. Her mental health was very bad. In terms of the movement and the religion, and it was all I knew, so I didn't have any other kind of perspective on whether it was what I wanted, whether I believed or not. I definitely believed it was, again, as I said, it was much harder leaving that environment and going into the normal world, the real world, actually, than anything. That was a real adjustment.
Celeste, because not only leaving the environment that you'd become familiar with, but leaving your mum there knowing that she wasn't completely well. How did you cope? I mean, what was that period of your life like?
It was tough. It was a lot of culture shock, so I went from a school where I'd never really heard a swear word to inner city London, where the first day of school, so I moved to Brixton to live with my grandmother, and I went to.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So she was still she was in Evandale Road still. Yeah.
So I moved into Evandale Road. And I went to the local Church of England primary school, St. John's Primary School, and it's actually kind of surrounded by the Angel Town estate.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, my first day of school, I think, you know, some kids wanted to fight with me, you know, and that was completely like, you know, I was, to be honest, I was quite amused, if anything, by the whole experience, because it was so bizarre, you know, and it was so different. But I was a very resilient kid, so I was able to adapt quickly. And I think I was helped because my grandmother, who I went to live with, was, you know, Second World War generation, very stoic,
Right.
stiff upper lip, kind of very English grandmother, who she didn't tolerate any self-pity.
Right.
You know, so I just had to get on with it, and I did. So
You think that was helpful? You think that was helpful or a hindrance? You think that was helpful? That
I
attitude.
think for me and my character, it was helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it may not have been helpful for everyone, and now, you know, now it wouldn't it wouldn't be probably seen, you know, in the current sort of times as the best way of dealing with things. But for me, it was the right approach, definitely.
So that, now the film inevitably condenses a lot of years, but you know that was working for you. Your the care of your grandmother and adjusting to life here in Brixton, and around this time, or perhaps I suppose a little bit later, things appear to start improving for your mum. When did she eventually move away from the temple? I mean, you know, by the time we get into the early noughties, she's making music again, talking about the possibility. In fact, I think there's a reunion of X-Ray Specs in the late 90s, and then a sort of a more famous a couple of occasions later on. But you know, tell me what's happening with her during this period.
so my mum, when I went to live with my grandmother, shortly after, my mother moved also back to South London, mainly so she could be near me.
Right.
And so I could spend, you know, weekends with her, and that's kind of what happened. I spent the weekdays with my grandmother, and I would spend weekends with my mum until I was about 15, and then I went to live with my mum again full time. So that was actually quite good for her, in the sense that, you know, she was forced to look after her mental health. She became an outpatient, sometimes an inpatient, at the Maudsley. It's when she really got the correct diagnosis, and she was given medicine that worked. So that was, you know, quite good for her. And then she was able to, being in London, she was able to reconnect with music and X-Ray Specs, and she did, in the early 90s, she reformed X-Ray Specs. She did a gig at the Roundhouse, an album, Conscious Consumer. So you know, I think it was tough for her, obviously the whole experience of me, you know, moving out and living with my grandmother. It was really tough, but it was a catalyst for, you know, for my mum, I think, to start being an artist again, or a musician again, which was good. So, you know, it was she wasn't happy, obviously, with that transition initially, but then I think it was sort of worked out for the best.
Yeah, and it seems to have worked out for the best, not only in terms of her health, but also your relationship with her, because of course that, you know, that was you make it clear in the film that was often quite a troubled relationship, and you know, understandably so in lots of ways, but you seem to become closer to her through this period, and there are a couple of moments in the film which are incredibly powerful. One of them is when you join her on stage at the Roundhouse, but I think this is 2008. This is later on. Is that right?
Oh yeah, did I say she performed at the Roundhouse in the 90s? Sorry, that was the Brixton Academy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And yeah, the Roundhouse was in 2008, and that was the second time she reformed X-Ray Specs for a gig. And yes, that was an incredible moment for me to join her.
Sorry, just because my friends at Love Music Hate Racism won't forgive me if I don't put this on the record. She also played not only back at the most, I mean, X-Ray Specs opened the most famous Rock Against Racism Carnival in 1978 at Victoria Park, but in 2008 she also took to the stage back in Victoria Park for the Love Music Hate Racism Carnival. I think that was earlier in the year, perhaps in April. And then, yes, you join her on stage at the Roundhouse. You were concerned for her taking to the stage and revisiting that part of her life, but clearly this felt like a wonderful moment of connection. Tell me how that felt for you.
It was amazing for lots of reasons. One was that I had formed my own band that year, and we opened for my mum's band. So we opened for X-Ray Specs. So that was my first gig, basically, was at the Roundhouse. So I obviously had a lot of adrenaline, you know, and I was on a real high. And then joining my mum for the encore of Oh Bondage was the icing on the cake. It was an amazing evening, really. And my mum had a great time in the end. You know, she was quite nervous about it. Yeah. And the fact that she got up there and she pulled it off, it was great to see. But yeah, it took a lot out of her. Like, performing live was, you know, it was something that she really, you know, she might have enjoyed really in the early days, but it wasn't, she didn't enjoy it too much.
But she obviously, she was enjoying making music sufficiently to agree to make another album, Generation Indigo. Did you collaborate with her on that album?
Yes, yeah. So we worked on, I co-wrote a couple of the songs, one of which was Black Christmas. And we recorded that together with the Youth, the producer. He produced that album, and that was so I spent quite a lot of.
Black Christmas was the single, I seem to remember.
It was one of the singles, yeah. There was also Generation Indigo, Virtual Boyfriend, and Black Christmas. I think those were the singles. But yeah, I recorded that track with my mum at Youth's studio, which was really fun. He's a great guy. We also interviewed him for the film and the book. So yeah, lovely experience. My mum loved making music. You know, she loved writing, she loved recording, rehearsing. It was just the experience of performing live. I think because she had some traumatic memories from the early years, you know, that's what she struggled with more than anything. But she was always making music. She never stopped making music, you know, throughout her life. From, you know, she must have been 15 when she started writing songs, and, you know, she continued to the end.
Now, and also always making visual art. Is that true to say? Yeah.
Yes. So she was
writing poetry and writing and so on. I mean, she really was, you know, an artist in the broadest and best sense. Yeah.
She was very artistic in terms of visual art. So she was always drawing, painting. Collage was what she was most sort of kind of into, especially in the 70s. Collage and punk, it was a thing, and she loved that. She also made her own clothes. She was a great seamstress, so she would make her own clothes from scratch. And writing, she was always writing, whether it was lyrics, whether it was, you know, stories, short stories, poems. So yeah, she was definitely a multidisciplinary artist, and without any formal training, which is, you know, which is amazing. She never went to art school. I remember there were a few comments once on an article, you know, comments on, I think it was The Guardian, and there were some comments in the comment section, and someone was like, oh, you know, they were an art school band, or she'd gone to art school as a criticism. And,
Right.
and I find that hilarious, because she left school at 15 without, you know, completing her O levels. She had no qualifications whatsoever, let alone going to art school. She maybe, you know, she belonged to some like art clubs, you know, after school clubs and things like that. But that was the extent of her training. So she was really self-taught in everything.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I must say, when I look around at, I mean, there are many honourable exceptions, but I feel like at the moment, when I look around at artists, pop stars, and so on, so many of them are sort of so posh and polished and focused on their career in a very conventional way. You know, they're actually quite bland. Where, you know, more polystyrenes, please, I find myself
Yeah.
thinking. But let me take you back to that period then. You're working on Generation Indigo. Your relationship with your mum appears, at least, to be in great shape, possibly the best it's been for a long time. And then, of course, you receive the devastating news that your mum has breast cancer. That must have been that must have been a devastating piece of news to receive.
Yes, devastating for my mum, for me, but for the whole family. It was very unexpected. You know, she was diagnosed, and it had already spread to, you know, to most of her body. So she didn't live, you know, much longer than the diagnosis. Which is awful. It's really hard to deal with. But on the other hand, there is a blessing there as well, because it's not something that she had to struggle with, you know, for years and years. You know, and my mum was very stoic about death, and she had great spiritual strength and a very firm belief in an afterlife. And I think all of those things helped her, really helped her. She was very strong and very positive throughout, and so that is that gives, you know, that gives me strength. And it's not, I don't necessarily look back on her diagnosis and even her dying as a traumatic experience, really, because of her strength and the way she approached it. You know, it was like a lesson about how to approach dying.
Your mum had very strong religious and spiritual beliefs. Her wish was that you scatter her ashes in a holy place in India. And I think one of the most powerful moments in the film is when you make the trip to India to do exactly that. You describe that action as setting her free. But I'm wondering, Celeste, did it also help to set you free? Does it help you to sort of to come to some sort of sense of resolution about your relationship with your mother and that chapter in your life?
Yes, definitely. You know, going to India, it was her last wish, and it was something that I didn't do immediately. You know, I waited a few years. I kind of put it off. I had a lot going on, and so it was that trip to India with her ashes was really, for me, like maybe more significant than her funeral, because it was really more personal. It was just like, you know, it was me and her on that journey. That was where I could really say goodbye to her and really feel like I had carried out her wishes. So it was, you know, there was a great sense of resolution there. And also just being in India, I mean, it wasn't the first time I've been to India. We went together when I was a teenager, for the first time, but my mum had been there 7 or 8 times in her life. So it was you know, India was so important to my mum. So being there and going to the places that she went to, that had so much meaning for her, obviously it was, you know, for me, very rich, a very rich experience. And then obviously we went back to India to film. And you know, I feel like India has a special place in my heart as well, because, you know, because it was so important to my mum, and I was also able to make new memories there. So it's, yeah, very, that whole experience was amazing. Yeah.
So your mum has been set free, in a sense you have too, and you've now created these wonderful legacy pieces for your mum. You've already mentioned your music. You're clearly an extremely talented writer, filmmaker. What's next for Celeste Bell?
Well, I'm also a teacher, so I will probably continue teaching. And you know, I want to continue writing and continue with filmmaking if I can, and maybe music. Music has been really neglected. I've neglected music for a long time now. And it's something I would like to get back into. But at the moment, I'm working on a project, you know, a book, maybe a book, could be a book, film, you know, project, exploring more my experiences in the Hare Krishna movement, and the Hare Krishna movement, the history of the movement and its significance to cultural history, is something I'm really interested in, obviously because I grew up in it, but also because I'm fascinated with new religious movements. Wow. And that period of history. I studied history. I studied English and history at uni, and I think I approached, you know, the book and the film in many ways as a historian, even though it was my own, you know, my family story. But that's kind of how I like to approach these things. So yeah, I would like to just do a more thorough investigation of the Hare Krishna movement, and that's the next project.
Fascinating. Well, I shall look forward very much to that. But for now, thanks so much for making the time to speak with me. Thanks, Celeste Bell. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. Take care.